Well, it does turn out I was right about that. There is just a little tiny bit more to say, right? And actually, the thing that there is to say, sort of at the end of this play, is that we are going into, in the next couple weeks, um, some very different sorts of plays. I know I keep saying that, right? That, No Exit is weird, but not the weird that Waiting for Godot is, and Waiting for Godot isn't the same weird that Endgame is, and Endgame isn't going to be the same weird that, right? I understand that we keep kind of going around in circles with that, but um, what we are really looking at as we continue moving forward is different forms of the same sort of absurd. When Estlin points out that the plays of the absurd sort of have all been categorized, post having been written, and that now people are writing in this style, whether or not they mean to be writing absurdist plays or not, they're writing in a style that's going to be, ultimately considered absurd for, as long as a lot of these playwrights write. What we are primarily referring to is, again, that distance between what we expect and what we get, the distance between what the characters are expecting and what they get, the sort of despair that we feel upon realizing that we have so much less control, or maybe not even that we have so much less control, that we really don't understand how to get control. We see mechanisms that we think are going to fix our situation, and they're not working, right? And that this is really, for Beckett, for Ionesco, for Genet, meant to be, right, a turning up to 11, if you want to borrow a term from like Spinal Tap, right? But a turning up to 11 of what it sometimes feels like to be alive, right? That the absurd that we feel is often, there's so much at play, there's so much going on that we just can't figure out how to make sense of it. And then when we try to slow down and say, let's just sit and think and figure out what's, other weird things keep happening, right? I'm very much reminded of the way that it felt during the pandemic for my wife and I, right? And if we go back to a situation like the plague, right, where we're looking at that and everybody's sort of reacting to a plague in real time at that point in time, and they're suddenly experiencing the weirdness of getting silverware in individually wrapped packages, right? And they're suddenly realizing that the streets should be completely silent, but there are still people out, even in the face of a pandemic that is going to threaten to kill them, right? That when I look back at my own experience of the pandemic, at the time I was doing plumbing work, and my wife was working in a warehouse, and so both of us were going to work, right? As usual, and I was going to work as usual because we were doing new build plumbing, and so I was working in all these houses that nobody was in, nobody was living in, right? That there were still people coming in and doing all the work that needed to be done, and putting up drywall and putting in electricity, and I was putting in pipes and sometimes putting in finishes so that people could eventually move into a house. So I was out a lot seeing the world, and a lot of other people were sort of stayed at home because they were working from home and working on Zoom, and I was doing both. But the absurdity of that situation, of going home sometimes at night and thinking to ourselves, we know that we need to stay home and stay safe and take care of ourselves, and that when we did go out, we had to wear masks and all of these things, and but it felt so odd to sometimes feel like, boy, I just want to rebel and go out and do stuff, right? And looking around and also saying, where did this come from? Why is it still happening? And there are no good answers to it. Nobody really knows, because we're doing the best we can to figure out, how it works and how the disease works, and whether or not there will be, a vaccine at some point, and it feels absurd, right? It feels like an absurdist situation to be in, right? And you may have experienced that as well as students, doing school on Zoom, and so I think that when we look at these plays, right, what's coming up is not going to resemble the same thing we just saw, but it's going to be different parts of life that are turned to 11, right? When we look at Ionesco, we're going to look at two different, right, plays by Ionesco. We sort of have already, prepared for that. That we're going to be seeing, right, a little bit about how communication doesn't really work all the time, how humor is different for people, how humor is based on the absurd in general. And when we look at the plays that we've just seen, are they funny? I don't think they are. I don't think they're necessarily always meant to be. But as Nell says, right, in these in Endgame, there is nothing funnier than the unhappiness of other people, right? And Nag is sort of horrified by this statement. But I think we do see that in this particular play, that the absurd often is dealt with humor because there is no other way to do it, right? It's the unexpected. And whether it's a funny unexpected or a really tragic unexpected, sometimes there is nothing else you can do but find it to be somewhat funny. It's not my unhappiness, it's theirs, right? And we rely on that for humor all the time, right? We're going to talk about that quite a bit when we talk about, the humor of the existential and the humor of the absurd. There is a lot of humor in it that is based on other people's unhappiness, right? And that goes back to classic theater, right? That we find it funny when people are, punished for things that we might otherwise be punished for, but it's not us getting in trouble, it's them. So, so that's kind of all I wanted to say today. So the only other video I'm posting today is going to be about, right, the papers that you're going to be presenting, the topics that you're going to be presenting by the end of the week, right, to sort of let me know what you're planning to do your presentation on. I did want to do one additional video on that, so coming up.